My name is Vanessa O'Sullivan. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party. I'm the organiser for the Munster region, and I'll be your chair for today. And just to explain how this meeting is going to conduct, we're going to have the two speakers speak for about 15-20 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for comments and discussions and questions, and then we'll ask the speakers to come back in at the very end. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Terry Eagleton.
I don't want to talk directly about Marx because most of what I say about him is included in this remarkably cheap and extraordinary, attractive book that I've written, which is if you buy a copy, you will get a free handshake from the author. 2 copies, you might get a kiss. Maybe you prefer just to have 1 copy. I want to talk really about a rather marginal topic in a way, which is about belief. You might call it capitalism and fundamentalism, perhaps. Some wit once remarked. How's that? Can you hear that better? Yes? No?
A little bit higher, yeah.
How about that? Is that better? Yeah? Good. Some wit once remarked that it's when religion starts to interfere with your everyday life that it's time to give it up. It's actually quite funny if you think about it. Religion's supposed to be about your everyday life, yes. In other words, it's a bit, that's the kind of alcohol view of religion, you know. A small dose at weekends is fine, you know, but you shouldn't let it, you know, dominate your existence. And that is a view very typical of the modern age. In fact, there's something that you might call the symbolic sphere in human society, and within that I would include religion, sexuality, art, or 2 other things. And what happens in modernity, with the development of capitalist liberal modernity, is that all of these activities become somehow privatized. They're removed from the public sphere to some extent. They're no longer integrated so much as they used to be in pre-modern societies with ethics, politics, state, and so on. Yes. Now, that privatization of these things, that privatization of the symbolic sphere that we see in modernity has to be looked at dialectically, just as Marx, of course, famously has undying praise for the middle class, yes. Anybody you meet who doesn't like the middle class is certainly not a Marxist, you know, whatever, they may be a truculent adolescent or something. Thought that the middle class was by far the most revolutionary force in human history, and at the same time, of course, its tale was one of thrilling emancipation, and at the same time, of course, he thought that it was one long nightmare, one long tale of wretchedness and oppression. Similarly, one has to be dialectical, I think, about this privatization of the public sphere, because on the symbolic sphere, because on the one hand, that's an enormous emancipation. For these things to become, as it were, taken out of the political, the state, the public sphere, frees them in certain vital ways. The purity plea, as far as sexuality is concerned, the purity police are no longer going to break down your bedroom door. As far as art is concerned, the state will no longer dictate to you what to write, or paint, or sing, or perform. As far as religion is concerned, the power of a privileged priestly caste is overthrown, and religion, as in Protestantism, is now a matter between you and God. All right. The downside of this, the loss involved in this, is also pretty large. It means effectively that these things are now nobody's business but your own. They're individualized, privatized, to some extent trivialized, reduced, you might say, to a sort of harmless pastime, you know? So that these things become like, you know, breeding gerbils or, you know, dressing up as a nurse in the privacy of your bedroom, which I'm told Mitt Romney does quite often. if anybody wants to know the rest of that story, if you just approach me later for a very modest fee. I was once in the Mormon University in the United States, and I had the honour of actually seeing the celestial underpants. Not literally, but I just peeked up the shorts of a young man who was lying on the grass. I assure you I had no other motive whatsoever in doing this, and there were the temple garments, the celestial underpants. Anyway, I could give you a lecture about that actually if you prefer, but maybe I should get back to what I was saying. So these things become, in a sense, emancipated. You know, the state is no longer going to regulate them, but by the same token, they become marginalized, privatized, individualized, nobody's business but your own. Like, as I say, harmless pastimes. I mean, it's true that, you know, that sex is rather more interesting than breeding gerbils on the whole, you know. Nevertheless, it assumes that kind of status. Contrast that with pre-modern traditional societies. Contrast that, say, with Islamic culture. What's striking there is that you're, in a sense, public at stake in all of these activities which in the West has become privatized. Sexuality, art, religion are integrated tightly into the ethical and political and institutional life, state life, of those societies. And this, again, is both loss and gain. You know, this, again, has to be assessed dialectically. On the one hand, these things have a much greater public resonance and urgency. They're not just a matter of private individuals. On the other hand, of course, it can lead to a very ugly form of authoritarianism in which sexuality, art, and other activities is regulated by the state. What we have, in other words, what we confront in the world today, in the contrast between advanced capitalism on the one hand and radical Islam on the other, is what you might call a contrast between too little belief and too much. An impoverishment of belief in advanced capitalist societies and an excess or surfeit of it in radical Islam. And then there are people like me who stand in the middle, you know, neither believing too much nor too little, leaning neither to one side nor to the other, but embodying a certain norm, you know, of how everybody else ought to behave if only they had any sense. Take, for example, the liberal state. Yes, the liberal capitalist state, an enormously emancipatory achievement in many ways, as Marx is the first to recognize and to honour. The liberal state has no beliefs of its own. Yeah? Its only belief is that you should be allowed to believe what you want as long as your beliefs don't interfere with other people's beliefs. That kind of negative conviction is the only official one that the liberal state has. And that's an excellent thing. At the same time, it has a negative side. Belief is bad for business. Business doesn't really need conviction, and conviction is politically divisive. Yeah? So the liberal state tries to get by on as little of the stuff as it can, you know, like a recovering drug addict. You know, conviction is bad for you. If you then hit an enormous political crisis at which you're confronted by an enemy, radical Islam, who has no problem at all about absolute metaphysical fundamentalist beliefs, would they did, then you are bound to find yourself in a kind of ideological crisis, because the sorts of pragmatic, relativistic, secular, rationalist thought forms by which advanced capitalism lives just are not really ideologically enough to confront that kind of political enemy. Capitalism, in a certain sense, is the first, historically, fully rational, pragmatic, non-metaphysical life form in history. It's true, of course, that it's awash with religion, not least in the good old United States, which is at once the most materialist and most metaphysical society on earth. Interesting story there, but like the underpants, I wouldn't pursue it. The point is, capitalism probably could go post-metaphysical. It probably could divest itself of the sometimes embarrassing lumber of religious and other kinds of metaphysical beliefs, but it doesn't really have the courage to do so, you know, to survive by its own pragmatic resources. Long ago, Nietzsche advised it to do exactly that. He said, God is dead, and moreover, you don't need him. But, people insist on getting some fundamental answers to important questions. So capitalism can't really do that, just as you might say it was beginning to do so, just as a postmodern capitalism was growing up, in which, sort of really pragmatism seemed to be all. Just then, 2 aircraft slammed into the World Trade Center. Yeah? And suddenly, you were faced with a whole new ideological crisis where somehow that kind of suspicion that conviction itself is dogmatic, that conviction itself is authoritarian, which so permeates a postmodern culture, suddenly seemed to be no longer enough. Incidentally, I teach a great deal in the United States where, as you know, young people every 4 seconds say like, and increasingly elsewhere as well, one of America's imperial exports. That, of course, is all to do with a feeling that conviction is somehow dogmatic. To say it's 9 o'clock is unpleasantly authoritarian and certain, or to say it's like 9 o'clock is simply provisional and tentative and open-ended and so on. Right. Now, the problem is, it's not just that some people believe too much and some people believe too little, and I'm in the middle. The problem is that each of those camps keeps painting the other into a corner. And the more faithless capitalism becomes. Capitalism is an intrinsically faithless system. I mean, people might go to church and so on, but I mean, when it comes to faith, you don't look at what people say, you look at the beliefs embodied in their practices. And capitalism is right the way through a profane secular system, yes. And that trampling over beliefs in the name of turning a fast buck, then politically forces all those who are frightened by this brittle, two-dimensional, smart-ass modernity into more and more hatred. Fundamentally, it's about fear. It's about anxiety, whether you're talking about Texans or Talibans. Basically, it's a sense of being passed over by that. So each of these camps keeps, as it were, forcing the other one into a corner. The West finds itself ideologically, spiritually, if you like, depleted, just when it's confronting an enemy that is anything but. And here it has a choice. Either it can take the Nietzschean road and go post-metaphysical. It can decide that it doesn't really need these metaphysical values. But that's risky. That's risky because people like answers to big questions, not least in political crises. Or it can try to renew its metaphysical resources. All kinds of Western ideologues are now talking about the Enlightenment, about science, about reason, about progress, ideas that only about 10 years ago postmodernism was supposed to have left behind. But since then, with a new political global phase, it's as though the West needs much deeper and richer resources than that. So people like my old late friend and enemy, Christopher Hitchens, with whom I once used to leaflet the Oxford car factory, but he saw reason, grew up. I was going to say sobered up, but that's probably not quite the right phrase to use. We're suddenly reinventing, bringing back the very kinds of huge narratives of science, reason, progress that belonged to the bourgeoisie in its earlier phase. They were suddenly, just as they'd been apparently superannuated, rendered redundant, they really were brought back very much. All right. Let me just finish by pointing out two ironies about the present situation. One is that in the 1990s, true to the ideological climate that I've just been trying to describe, some Western ideologues, as you know, announced the death of history, the end of history, the end of so-called grand narratives. There was, capitalism, what that really meant was capitalism was, and now would be, the only game in town. Yes, there was a triumphalist flush in the post-Cold War years, which regarded that kind of situation as now here to stay. There would be no grand alternative to capitalism. Instead, as the postmodernist depressingly remarked, the future would be the same as the present with more options. Now, it quite often happens in history that an attempt to close down history, to blow the whistle on it, declare it over, and we've won, actually, ironically, succeeds in springing it open again. Hegel thought with becoming modesty that history had now culminated inside his own head. All that did was to produce people like Marx and Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and a lot of people who then took up that and began to argue with it. So attempts to close down history, since they are themselves historical events, normally succeed only in generating more of the stuff, piling more history onto what you were trying to eradicate in the first place. So what happened, I think, in the post-Cold War years was that the sort of flush of triumphalism of a West that has seen off its traditional political enemies and was also in some ways riding high economically, led to a certain overreaching on the part of the system. Yes, that led then to a backlash from those who were getting the sticky end of the capitalist system, not least in Muslim societies and elsewhere, and that in turn led to the beginning of a new grand narrative, namely the war between capitalism and the Quran, or a certain rather perverse and fundamentalist misreading, if you like, of the Quran. The attempt to close down one grand narrative only succeeded in springing open another, and that quite often happens. Second irony, on which I'll close, is this. That same triumphalism, that same post-Cold War sense that the system could just ride roughshod over its enemies, see them off, as we know, led in the end, as such triumphalism often does, such arrogance and over-assertion often does, to an enormous financial and economic crisis of that very system. There is a relation between that sense of euphoria, and we can do anything, and what then happened a few years ago. Yeah? And of course, a crisis of the system, as we know, is the left's opportunity. It's not least an opportunity, because one reason that the ruling class don't like their systems to be in crisis is that they show them up as systems. Yes? A crisis of the system denaturalizes it, makes it seem new and strange. It's no longer the everyday colour of daily life itself. It's one, you have to look at certain laws, you have to look at the limits of it, and then you begin to think of possible alternatives to it, or how it first emerged in the first place, and that which was born can always die. Yes? You don't want people to think of a system in that way. So one of the embarrassing aspects of a crisis is that it actually makes the system newly perceptible in the eyes of people who perhaps didn't see it that way. But the irony is, and here I really will it, is that the very overreaching of capitalism which made that crisis, brought that crisis being, also, of course, involved a rolling back of the left in those years of triumphalism. So that by the time the crisis arrived and the opportunity arrived, the left had been forced on the back foot by the very same global factors which had created the crisis in the first place. How is that going to work out? I don't know.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that, Terry. I'll hand you over to the next speaker, who is going to be Kieran Allen, activist with the Socialist Workers Party in Dublin and author as well. A lot of his books are down at the bookshop that you can see afterwards.
Okay, I want to start with the banks. Do we, for example, know what have the banks been up to since, if you like, they pushed money in Ireland and money has been sent back to be recapitalised and so on? If you look at a recent Oxfam 2-minute YouTube video, it's a brilliant video about how the major banks in Europe, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, have moved into speculation on food. And the way it works is quite simple. Food has to be grown over some time span, wheat, soybeans and so on. And what most of the major banks are now doing is speculating on indexes for how these prices will rise in the coming years. And as a result, if we look, for example, at maize, 65% of the maize between 2013, 14, 15 has already been bought by the major speculators in food. 80% of the world's wheat has already been bought up. And the result of this has been a huge increase in prices. In Nigeria, for example, the price of a ton of wheat 2 years ago was $100. It's now $300. We now find, for example, that approximately 100 million people have been pushed into starvation because of this speculation. So we're dealing with really quite an extraordinary system. And I think the point of Marx is it gives us a toolkit for beginning to analyse why it works like this in order to overthrow it. Marx's essential point is it's down to capital. Now, capital is an interesting word. It doesn't refer to just machines, because when we look at capitalists, the interesting thing about capitalists is they have no particular loyalty to any one form of making money. They will move from speculation in food, to property prices, to investing in agriculture, to investing in manufacturing. They're continually morphing. The thing about capitalism is it's fluid and it morphs all the time. And therefore, if you take some of the major corporations in the world, people like, most people haven't heard of, Fidelity Investments or Blackstone, these people have shares in oil, in food speculation, and anything. And what capital, Marx argued, is about, it's about its own self-expansion. Capital is human energy, human labour, congealed into becoming a social force that dominates our lives, even though originally it comes from our own particular labour. And that, if you like, image of capital is absolutely vital for understanding it. Because we live in a world where we're told that, it's a sick world, but basically people have been reduced to being customers, and the task of capitalists is to serve the customer. The main, for example, marketing slogan of the people coming out of MBA classes is, "The customer is the king." Now, the only problem with this is capitalism does not particularly serve customers. If it did, it would not be making, if you like, machines that continually break down. It would not be producing textbooks you have to continually revive. It would not be, if you like, building in obsolescence into their very products. What capital is about is simply its own self-expansion. And that was Marx's fundamental vision, that the system is anarchic and is driven not by anything to do with the needs of people, but by the determination of capital to expand itself. Now, how, therefore, do we actually go about challenging this? And this is where I think that we have to understand the value of Marx. Marx is not a guru. Marx sometimes says occasionally stupid things. He occasionally said outdated things on, for example, the benefits of child labour. I think he was completely wrong about. That's not why, if you like, Marx is worth looking at. Marx is worth looking at because of the method by which he tries to equip people to overthrow this system. And essentially what Marx does is, one way of, if you like, challenging a society where people are driven into food poverty because of speculation is to morally denounce it. To call it evil, to attack it, to say it's wrong, and because of that, because of the need for justice, to overthrow it. And of course, socialists do all these things. We do, and we very morally are repelled by what capitalism does. But if that was all we were able to do, the system would survive. And what Marx does, I think, is instead of simply looking at its moral condemnation, he looks for its internal contradictions. He tries to find its self-destruct button, and through that shows a way in which it can actually be overthrown. And when we look at it from this point of view, Marx argues that there are two main contradictions in the economy of capitalism. And here, one of the, if you like, problems in terms of people accessing Marx is that people often think about it as economics. And economics in our society, like mathematics, because of the way in which capital dominates our lives, is often seen in itself, the study of it, the mere study of it, as something extremely alien. For Marx, there isn't something called economics. There's not a sphere of life called economics. What we mean is simply human to fit with our needs. That's all it means. It means many, many different aspects. It's not simply about euros and cents. It's about how we organise that fundamental feature of human life, that we have to try and make tools, we have to transform nature, and we have to enter into relationships with each other to do that. From that point of view, this particular system, capitalism, has a number of contradictions that will lead to the possibility of self-destruct. And those contradictions are, first of all, I mean, we don't need to spend a long time on it in this country. They are, first of all, its tendency to over-accumulate, to produce too much for those who need to buy its products. You look, for example, at the Celtic Tiger. I mean, it's unbelievable now. We were producing 90,000 housing units a year. It's now gone down to 15,000 housing units a year. The only purpose of doing that, I mean, all sorts of people wrote nonsense, and they were paid to write nonsense about the demographic bubble, that we had to have these houses and so on. The reality was capital was driven by its own desire to expand. It produces debt, and it produces a massive housing market. But ultimately, that same capital is trying to reduce wages, it's trying to reduce the wage packets of people, and at some point, this problem of overproduction hits capital and leads to a crisis. And when that happens, I mean, Ireland is a textbook case what happens, and shows us why we cannot accept the rule of this impersonal force called capital. In 2007, 48 billion euros was invested in the Irish economy. That's why people had jobs, a good life, a relatively good life at the time. That has now shrunk in the space of a few years down to 18 billion first of all, and last year down to 16 billion. So the people who control capital, or if you like this impersonal force that seeks to expand itself, have decided we are not going to invest in this economy, and therefore we, the people, become subordinate to its needs and its desire to expand itself. They begin, when people then tell you that investment has, if you like, declined, the next question you need to ask is, where has it gone? Where has it gone? And what you find is, it's back into the banks, it's back into food speculation, it's back into speculation on commercial property, for example, in Britain. And Marx's second argument, and this will be dealt with in more detail tomorrow, is that because capitalism is driven by this need to expand, it will come to a halt when the rate of profit, the return on investment, begins to decline. And broadly speaking, that has been the pattern over the last number of decades with some variation. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that Marx was dismissed, particularly after the fall of Eastern Europe, as somebody who was irrelevant, out of date, but his actual prediction about these contradictions would come back to haunt capital have now come back with a vengeance. And it's important that we understand that the type of economic crisis, now 4 years, getting to be normal, this economic crisis is of the same level of the crisis in the 1930s and before that in the Great Depression of the 1875 period. This is a systemic crisis that raises the question of the existence of capitalism itself. And Marx then, I think, is also important for his understanding of an agency that can overthrow capitalism. We are in a world where the working class have been dismissed as a potential agent of history, where, for example, you have an election in America where the word worker cannot be mentioned. You must use the code middle class, that means working class in America, where the idea that, if you like, anybody on a temporary job is part of something new called the precariat, not the proletariat. The working class apparently have disappeared. Marx's huge, and I think absolutely central vision, is the importance of working people as an agent of change. And here we have to be clear what we mean by the working class. David McWilliams, for example, in a recent book in Ireland, defined Irish society as 2/3 middle class, because people work in the services industry, because they're not working in factories, and clearly they're not working in factories in Ireland. It's important that we understand working class as anybody who has to sell their labour to survive, and whose labour are controlled by other people. Those two simple definitions obviously gets blurry on the edges and so on, but that is what constitutes, in many countries, the first revival of the struggle against this system will come in the form of social movements. The Indignados movement in Spain, the anti-household charges movement here. It is probably the case that people will use a different language to Marx, will not see it in terms of capital, may see it in terms of enforced debt, or whatever way people see it. But the point, I think, is, if this system is to be uprooted, that social movement has to make a link with organised workers. because it's organised workers who are at the heart of the system who can actually stop this process by which capital seeks endlessly to expand itself. And therefore I think the model in many ways for what can happen in Ireland is seen in, if you like, what's happening in Spain. A movement that began, as I understand it, first of all with resistance to housing evictions, generalising into the indignant movement, using the rhetoric about real democracy rather than fake democracy, and then through political argument and through discussion, where initially people were hostile to the very idea of unions, the energy of that movement coming to fuse with organised workers' movements in Spain, so we now see the possibility of general strikes. That is what's possible in Ireland, and that for me is very central to Marx's vision. And lastly, in terms of Marx's vision, the question is, where does all this go? And here I think the idea that Karl Marx was somehow an economic reductionist and didn't think about all, or talk about, or write about all the other aspects of life, I think is belied by Marx's fundamental passion for freedom and the fight for freedom. When Marx was a teenager, his teacher in the local school was hauled out by the then equivalent of the special branch, called, if you like, the police force at the time, for the charge of atheism. And that left Marx with an abiding hatred of the idea that the state could control people's beliefs, that the state somehow rose above society as the embodiment of human rationality. It left Marx with an abiding hatred of the very idea of a state that towers above us and oppresses us. And therefore any notion that Marx, or if you like, socialism, was about state control, about, if you like, having a state ownership rather than freedom, that was the fundamental distortion introduced into Marxism by the Stalinist tradition. What Marx was about, and makes it very, very clear, was the destruction of the state. For us, therefore, the struggle in Ireland is about certainly getting people into Parliament, articulating a view, but ultimately our aim is to destroy the structure of a state that is built on a privileged elite, a civil service that's not fully transparent even to elected representatives, a highly repressive apparatus, a deep state that is based on defending elitism. We want to see the destruction of that state. And that is what Marx means by revolution. And I'll finish on this. A revolution is when the mass of the people, given these contradictions, given these crises, are impelled to act. And in any real revolution in history, people do not set out with a defined goal, a programme of where we're going, absolute clarity for the word goal. What tends to happen is revolts happen when, if you like, things that people believe are theirs of a right are taken from them, and they have to go into battle to actually defend them. A revolution is not the end of the battle against capitalism. A revolution is about destroying the state that upholds capitalism, about uprooting the power of, if you like, the capitalists in the factories and the offices, the power of money. But that has to be done suddenly, effectively, through mass mobilisation. But the longer process, and it very much is a longer process, and a process that's not just built on any utopia that's going to happen overnight, the longer process of constructing a society where the purpose of economic relations is human need, not profit. The purpose of human relations is to create work that is enjoyable, to, if you like, integrate mental labour and manual labour. That is a longer process.
In relation to what the panelist said, Terry Eagleton talked about in one of his books on evil. He didn't mention it, but in relation to Marx's philosophy and the view of the future, in that book he argues that evil has a metaphysical existence beyond social conditions. And I know that in Marx's philosophy, the ideal is to change social conditions to make the world more just, and in the process remove those sources of evil and make the world more just and utopian, and to change the human being to make them more just. So can I ask you, in relation to the metaphysical existence of evil, and let's say in psychiatry, apparently 1% of the population is naturally psychopathic, and particularly 3% of CEOs have been diagnosed to be naturally, innately psychopathic. How does that affect the Marxist view of the future? Does that make utopia somewhat impossible. And secondly, could I ask you, in relation to Benjamin Barber's work, he claimed that in order to consume the excesses of production, people would have to be made more narcissistic by advertising and marketing and hedonistic. Does he envisage a point in the future whereby we'll have gladiatorial contests and some level of brutality like that, such that that will become one of the internal contradictions that cause the destruction of capitalism, that it becomes so dumbed down? And just lastly, would it be possible for you for some scholar academic to compare how neoliberalism tries in its project to destroy the state, to compare that with how it envisions a stateless society, with how Marxism envisions a stateless society, a comparison and contrasting with those two? Thanks very much.
I mean, I don't want to answer for Terry, I'm sure he'll come back on it himself, but certainly from my point of view, I suspect what Terry might have meant in terms of the clash between capitalism and Islam is how the system has ideologically presented itself recently in order to justify itself, rather than that being the, if you like, the real underlying conflict. I think Islamophobia, inciting Islamophobia, has been a central part of the system repackaging itself to justify what it's doing in the Middle East and present itself as democratic, civilized, liberal, and so on, as against the extremists. And it's worth saying, and I think maybe Terry was hinting at it as well, is that the other manifestation of that notion of extremism that we've got to be careful about is actually the activist, is the person with conviction, not just the Islamist activist, but any sort of activist who believes in anything and wants to fight for something is to be treated as an object of suspicion. And in fact, we're having this at the moment with the Civita issue. Because the line, faced with this crisis as a result of the political cowardice and failure of the state to deal with the issue of abortion, it's calm down. Let's everybody calm down. Let's have vigils. And let's not get worked up. Let's not talk about politics. This was the line from the government during the week. This is a terrible human tragedy. Let's not get political. And of course, precisely what it calls for is action and anger and politics. In order to understand how the hell we could have such a tragic circumstance and what the hell are we going to do in order to make sure it never happens again. And that absolutely calls for politics. And the point I want to make about Marx, which maybe hasn't been touched on, although it's implicit, is Marx didn't, I think, just provide the tools for understanding the system. He also crucially called for action. And he I think it was Engels at his deathbed said, first and foremost, Marx was a revolutionary. And Marx commented in the face of people who understood Marxism as being just about analysis. The one thing I know is I'm not a Marxist. That kind of Marxist that is just analysing but not doing. Because for him, his understanding of capitalism was that it threw up crises where the system did come into view and where the possibility for change presented itself, but that there was absolutely nothing inevitable about there being a progressive outcome to that crisis. As he says on the first page of the Communist Manifesto, when these crises happen, you can have the revolutionary reconstitution of society, or you can have the mutual ruination of the contending classes. Trotsky similarly said in 1913, looking at the Balkans Wars, which were a little window into what was going to happen in the First World War, he said there is no crisis the capitalists can't get out of over the broken bones and bodies of the working class, as we have learned to our cost with 2 world wars in this century. So crucially, Marx, he analysed the system, he looked for its self-destruct button, he looked for its contradictions, but he understood you had to act. You had to act and intervene, because otherwise they would make us pay for their crisis, and their system wouldn't just fall apart, but would destroy us, possibly even itself, to prevent change unless people actively intervene. And I think that, they're all pertinent. Everything about Marx is pertinent, but to my mind, in the current situation, faced with the crisis of the system coming so sharply into view, the key thing is about a call to action. We've got to act, and then we will learn, as we act, about the best tactics and strategy to take us forward.
Just before the next speaker comes in, is there anyone else that wants to contribute to this meeting? No.
Action can be louder than words sometimes, louder even than language, and there are inherent risks with that. And God may not be missed, but in listening to Terry Eagleton this afternoon, I had a sense of his presence, to the extent maybe that that's one of the finest sermons I've heard in any church, or from any church in a long time, Terry. Thank you. And nonetheless, while you continue to sit on the fence, my hope is that at some stage you will actually find your true vocation, which may be something akin to a high priest of a postmodern society. Or of what, I don't know. What I do know is that I'm, as a human being, I'm quite an illogical person at times, and I find difficulty occasionally with the logic of revolutionary Marxism. Something about the idealism of Marxism in some way missing out on some of the undercurrents of semiotics of its own utopian aspirations. Thank you.
I want to start by just saying, in a second I'm going to say something in favour of revolutionary socialism, but or revolutionary Marxism. Yeah, I know, yeah. I'll get to say. But what I would say is the return of Marx. For me, the first thing that's really important about Marx is that Marx starts with a fundamental insight into the world, which is that we're humans, right? And if we want to have social relations that allow us to develop, we can't have social relations that allow capital to develop. It's simple. Capital, the barometer of rationality in capitalism is exploitation. If they can exploit at a high enough level, the system stays healthy. If they can't exploit at a high enough level, it goes into crisis. So their crisis really is a barometer of how irrational the system is from the point of view of human need and human development. And every few years it cries out again, this is not the way humans should organise their production. And it screams at us, let's do something about this to change the social relations in our interests. That's really what it's about. So for me, socialism is absolutely common sense. It's absolutely common sense if you're human that you would want to participate in a process that would bring progressive social change, and you have to do it through activity. And just to answer the question about why Marx didn't then go from that fundamental insight into a sort of a wide narrative of how that might look, and rather what he tried to do was really analyse the system, is because he felt, as a radical democrat, it wasn't his place to be putting forward all sorts of hodgepodge schemes about how other humans would live their lives. He felt, let's have faith that they'll be able to do it once they overthrow the tyranny of capitalism. So he's a radical democrat, and he believes in freedom, as someone said, and therefore he doesn't want to write cookbooks for the future. He wants to get people, give them the tools now to overthrow the oppression, and from there they will then have the ability themselves, through their own interactions, to build a society on the basis of human need. And so therefore, in terms of getting active, I just think it's very, very important that we don't come as consumers of information and come and have an intellectual discussion about the return of Marx and then go home and say, that was a great old discussion, must go back there next year again. This is the 5th year of the deepest crisis capitalism has had. And we know in the last crisis that when they had a whole decade of 50, 60 million people dying, that gave their system a rejuvenation. Yet more evidence that when our lives go into massive crisis, their system rejuvenates. So we need to take this opportunity to get active and get mobilised. And if you actually believe in a world that is without oppression and exploitation, get involved with the socialists, because it's the only way we're going to win. We can't win by just having discussions in this room. We've got to win on the streets, and we've got to make socialism the common sense of the next age. Thank you.
before I bring the speakers back in, first of all, there's a protest for Savita at 4 p.m. today, so all the meetings have been cancelled for people who want to go to that protest, and we'd encourage everyone to get to that protest. The next meeting, the next round of meetings that are back here is at 7 o'clock, and in this room it will be Richard Boyd Barrett talking about the extreme centre and how capitalism is destroying democracy, which is set to be a very interesting discussion. And the last thing I'd say is there's going to be a live music session after the last meeting, so please stick around for that. And of course, as I've said, there's a huge range of books in the bookshop over the course of the weekend. Please do visit, it'll be worth your while. So I'll bring Terry Eagleton back for about 5 minutes.
The first point was about Islam, working class. Islamic fundamentalism, the belief that by blowing the heads off small children in the name of Allah, you can further a progressive movement, is in my view obscene. And there is a hypocrisy in many parts of the left. Let's be clear about this. Yeah, I spoke in meetings up and down Europe before the Iraqi invasion, and I was dismayed by the mealy-mouthed, hypocritical language of some comrades on the left who, the very moment one even dared to criticise autocratic practices, nasty practices in Islam, you were told to leave the stage. That's a form of authoritarianism that we should not allow for one moment. The point there surely is this. There was a time in the mid-20th century when all kinds of progressive, radical, sometimes socialist, certainly revolutionary, nationalist forces were competing for power in the Middle East. The West, for its own reactionary purposes, smashed and drove back those forces one by one, from Nasserism to Indonesia to communism. The West created a political vacuum into which then some very ugly forces moved. So yes, in a sense it's our responsibility, but that doesn't give us any carte blanche to be mealy-mouthed about forms of politics which are stridently authoritarian and have nothing whatsoever to do with socialism. And until the left says that loud and clear, I don't think it will have any credibility to speak on the war on terror. I've just come back from Turkey. I've spoken in many Muslim societies where some Muslim intellectuals, left intellectuals, are horrified by that kind of hypocrisy. There was a question about postmodern capitalism. Some comrades said, well, capitalism has always been global. Postmodernism isn't, in fact, just about globalization. That's one dimension of it. It's about a lot of other changes in capitalism, too. Is it the case that capitalism is still exploitative, in many ways more so than it used to be? Yes. Is it the case that it's changed? Yes. And until we're able to hold those two ideas together in our minds, I think people are quite understandably going to say that we're behind the times. The question of evil, actually the comrade is not quite right. I did write a book on evil. One reason I wrote a book on evil, actually, is because the left is just so coy and shy about a whole series of vital human ideas. Love, death, suffering, evil, breakdown. Nothing to say. Basically nothing to say. But that is a disgrace. And what I've tried to do in my work is to widen and deepen, whether successfully or not I don't know, and certainly I've had a lot of brickbats for doing so from the left, widen and deepen the very languages and vocabularies that we speak. Because, and this point I'm going to make applies to some comrades who've spoken just now, if we keep simply repeating the same pieties and mantras, we're not going to convert anybody. Yeah? I believe in those mantras. I believe in those orthodoxies. I am an orthodox thinker. Yet every time, it seems to me, and this is a bit of a middle-aged grumble, so you can just turn off everything. Every time I come to a meeting like this and try, however modestly, to, as they say in that horrible phrase, push the envelope, use a few different ideas, get people to think beyond the box. What happens? People stand up. This happens to me in London, it happens to me in Paris, and reinstate the orthodoxies. Now, I've just said, I believe in those orthodoxies, but if we only do that, if we don't take on new kinds of thinking, new kinds of idioms, we're not going to get anywhere. Just to develop the point about evil, I didn't actually say in the book that evil was metaphysical. I said that evil is a very strange phenomenon, because evil seems to be, evil doesn't just mean very, very, very bad. Awful, don't do it. Evil means apparently doing wicked things for their own sake. One of the most frightening things about the Holocaust was there was absolutely no point to it. There was some point to Stalin butchering a lot of kulaks. There was some, in his twisted mind, there was some political point to that. There was no point whatsoever. The Holocaust was counterproductive. Unless the left is ready to stop just rejecting as metaphysical ideas like evil, or start thinking about ideas like death, or suffering, or human breakdown, the human condition. One of the advantages of a period in which the left is on the down, is that it actually helps to illuminate the limits of politics as well as the importance of it. I lived through, of course, that period in the 60s and 70s when the left was on the up, and we couldn't afford to think about things like that. People dismissed them, sneered at them, whoa, intellectual stuff, theory, And what do they say? Action, right? Well, you don't, of course, but you don't change the world without understanding it. Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach demands a little deconstruction there, just as it would be nice if a meeting like this, every time somebody stood up, they produced, first of all, before they started, 3 searing criticisms of Marx. That would be nice. That would bring people rolling in. That would bring people to say, these guys are actually intellectually honest. They see that Marx made a number of grotesque errors. Kieran touched on that. Kieran took that point. They didn't say what they were. Much in Marx's work is deep dive determinism. Marx once said that Germany, his own nation, had to go through capitalism to get through socialism. If we don't say these things, people will just not believe us. People will just write us off. So, we have to say the correct things, but unless we say just 1 or 2 different things as well, I think we're going to be written off as simply producing mantras and piety.
Thanks very much, Terry. Kieran Allen. 5 minutes.
I suspect there's quite a bigger debate there, which I will try to touch on maybe towards the end, but maybe just deal with some other points first. I think, first of all, the contribution from Africa is very important. The reference was to Ethiopia. This was a regime run by Haile Selassie, if you like, so-called Marxist, as it was called, regime called the Derg, comes into place and becomes one of the greatest oppressors of the Ethiopian people. Now, it's important, Terry talks about we shouldn't be dogmatic and so on. The first thing Marxists have to do is look at the world and give an opinion on those regimes that called themselves Marxists, which were in reality state dictators. And the opinion we have given for a long time is that those were tyrannies. They were, if you like, the state operating as a collective capitalist class to exploit people. And we are not in the least bit surprised that in places like Ethiopia or Poland or Romania, the same Communist Party bureaucrats who ran the state change their clothes and become the private capitalists who run the factories, or as Abdurrahman said, the farms. So, if you like, in terms of Marxism being modern, we have to address issues like that and be very clear on that particular approach. Secondly, on the issue of Marx and, if you like, not having an idea about the future. Now, this is a complicated question, right? And the way I want to put it is this. First of all, Marx, as the speaker said, quite rightly, rejected the idea of drawing up a perfect picture, a utopia. That was a literary device by people like Thomas More in some previous centuries to critique his own country of England. Utopia, by the way, meant nowhere. He didn't ever think was going to happen. So obviously Marx was not going to follow the same method in terms of drawing up the perfect society, the perfect blueprint, because as Brian indicated, that in itself would be a form of elitism, imposing that blueprint as a possible one for the future. What Marx tried to do was to look, as I said, at the contradictions in capitalism and the real social forces that we could move and use to create a new society. Let me then be specific. What is that? And I think, by the way, I do take the point that I think that although Marx, if you like, rejected utopia, I think that in the modern world of late capitalism, given the level of despair and anger against capitalism and the real striving for, so what exactly is your new society, I do agree with you, socialists are forced to move a bit further than Marx to try to spell out what we think, in all modesty, elements of that would be. And we have tried to do that in our tradition. One thing I just want to emphasise very importantly is the idea, again, which is contained in Marx, but it has to be elaborated, of self-management. In a capitalist society, we're so used to it, it has become normal. You have a manager. A manager does the thinking, a manager conceptualises, and a manager orders you about. Harry Braverman pointed out the word manager came from the word manage, that you do in horse training, right? It's to guide you and direct you and so on. Socialism envisages the possibility of self-management. We want to break down the gap between people who are paid to think, academics like myself and Terry, and people who are paid to wash toilets or clean toilets. We want to break down that gap, and we do not think anybody should be confined to simply taking orders or doing the work dictated by other people. And therefore self-management is the idea that the people who produce democratically in their economic life, as well as their, if you like, ballots and, if you like, elections nationally, come together on a regular basis to decide what is being produced, how it's going to be produced, and to organise themselves to produce. And in our belief is, and if you like, there is some evidence from this, and they're not pure Marxist examples, but, you know, there are elements of it. The Mondragon cooperative movement in Spain, where, for example, workers have regular assemblies to elect their manager, where the manager cannot be paid more, and we'd obviously reduce this, more than 8 times the average worker. We think these societies will lead to an unleashing of creativity that, if you like, renders questions like, so where will you get the 18 billion deficit, pretty meaningless, because the level of productivity that can come from people themselves running their own working lives, we think is immense. So Marxists have worked on the idea of self-management. In a more, and I can't get a chance to go into it here, but the idea of a planned economy. How exactly could you democratically decide the main ways in which investment would be allocated? Marx, if you like, are working on this and if you like, have come up with some ideas on that. So first of all, I think Marxist is being updated. Quickly, the question of the neoliberal state, neoliberalism trying to destroy the state, not true. Neoliberalism talked about getting rid of the state. Milton Friedman talked about the end of state spending. But the historic record of all neoliberal governments, from Thatcher to Reagan, is a never actually reduced state spending. What they wanted was an ideology, a mystery story, an idea the state is not there to help the mass of ordinary people, even in terms of ministerial reforms, but they wanted a strong state to crush workers, to do it, if you like, in terms of Thatcher, in terms of attacking the union. So I think the idea of the neoliberal state, neoliberalism trying to undermine the state, that was one of the mythologies. Let me then just finally come to a defence of the classic revolutionary tradition. I think, first of all, revolutionaries are motivated by different things. Some revolutionaries are motivated by books, by reading, by theories. Increasingly, other revolutionaries are motivated by basic necessity. I met somebody last Sunday who joined a socialist worker. I said, why did you join socialist worker? I'm on vacation, are blind to reality. I don't think it's true. Those socialists who've come from a different theoretical tradition, particularly I think the tradition we represent here, has always looked at the question of how exactly are we going to bring about change. Because Richard is right. The question of action. Marx's whole point was ideas, analysis of the world in order to change it. Perry Anderson once made a brilliant point about what's called the doctrine of historical materialism. We're supposed to learn this. This is Marx's great theory. I don't agree with Terry, but I'm not going to go into it now, in terms of determinism. Anderson made the point, the reason why Marx wrote about history, the pattern of history, is precisely so we learn lessons about how to change the future society. And when you actually look at the pattern of history, and you look at how, if you like, the forces, the technology that we've developed, and how they make cooperation so immensely possible, how so many, for example, younger people engage even unthinkingly in file sharing, in cooperating, in sharing music and culture, and how capitalism comes along with its stupid, imbecilic laws and says, this is owned, and there's a law against file sharing and, if you like, sharing knowledge. This shows you in microcosm how the possibility of cooperation is emerging. And therefore I don't think that socialists are idealistic in the sense of being blind. They are committed to the idea of struggle and are willing to examine the world. On the question of Islam, very finally, I think we probably have differences of emphasis here. But again, that's what Marxists do. We often have difference of emphasis, but we try to fight together. For us, it's, again, a meeting in itself, the question of Islam, or if you like, Islamic fundamentalism, correct, arose from the abject failures of some of the left in the Middle Eastern countries. One of the biggest communist parties in the world were in Indonesia and in Iraq. Tragically, those communist parties at various points in time had alliances with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and indeed with sections of the Indonesian elite and so on. They collapsed and they created a vacuum. And in that vacuum emerged an ideology which says, let us return to the pure form of religion in order to bring about an alternative to our society. We reject that. Of course we reject Islamic fundamentalists when they say that, if you like, gay people have not got a right to express themselves, when girls haven't got a right to school. Of course we reject all that. But we also understand that there are times when people will fight under the banner of religion, in however a confused way. And the key thing is to ask, what are they fighting and where are they going? If you were, for example, in the black movement in the 60s, many black movements in the 60s looked to Haile Selassie, the Rastafarian and so on, but they looked to him only as a banner in order to fight against racism. And in a similar way, instead of falling for the Islamophobia of the West, of picturing everybody who fights in the name of Islam as a fundamentalist and therefore irrational, unlike us good Catholics, we start by saying, what are they fighting for, under what banner, and if they're fighting, as Hamas is fighting at the moment, against imperialism, we are on their side.